American versus British versus German paratrooper. The Second World War was known for innovative tactics, perhaps the most iconic being that of paratroopers, men who jumped from aircraft deep behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, capture strategic objectives, and cause havoc in the enemy's rear areas. Since airborne forces were a new and experimental branch of service with no long-standing traditions, each nation that deployed them developed doctrines and practices from whole cloth. Regardless of their nation, paratroopers were light infantrymen, fast-moving troops who could strike unexpectedly, relying on mobility and surprise rather than raw firepower. In spite of the differences in weapons, doctrine, or uniform, there was still one thing that all paratroopers shared, and that was an esprit de corps, an elite status that separated themselves from other soldiers. These men volunteered to leap from aircraft well behind enemy lines, without resupply, without support, and no avenue of retreat. Whether they were British, American, or German, a paratrooper represented the elite, men who were braver, more daring, and more skilled than any other soldier. Training would be tougher than conventional infantry, which fostered a sense of superiority. According to the 10 Commandments of the Fallschirmjäger, or German paratroops, the first commandment reads, quote, "You are the elite of the Wehrmacht. For you, combat shall be fulfillment. You shall seek it out and train yourself to stand any test." End quote. Echoing this sentiment was Staff Sergeant Robert Rader of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, who said, quote, "The desire to be better than the other guy took hold." End quote. Counterintuitively, even though their missions were more dangerous, they felt safer knowing that the man next to him was not a desperate conscript, but a highly trained and motivated warrior who was more capable of pulling his own weight. Though they all shared this common trait, there were differences between German, British, and American paratroopers. Before a paratrooper could fight, they had to reach the drop zone, and more specifically, reach the ground safely. German, British, and American paratroopers all utilized parachutes which operated from a static line. As the trooper exited the aircraft, a line would be connected between the trooper and the aircraft, which would then become taut due to the weight of the trooper, deploying the parachute automatically. At no point would a paratrooper be in freefall. The parachutes used would be circular, with limited ability to maneuver. This was done deliberately to prevent the paratroopers from scattering and hopefully landing in a cohesive group. There were some differences, however. The German Fallschirmjäger's harness was attached at a single point in the center of the back, compared to the British and American harness, which was connected to the parachute with 2 points at the shoulder. This meant that the German paratrooper would exit the aircraft, usually a Junkers Ju-52, head first, and would eventually land on his hands and feet, or more specifically, knees, into a forward roll. Because of this, knee pads made from leather or thick canvas were a standard part of the Fallschirmjäger's gear. The German method allowed the paratroopers to drop at lower altitudes, which meant that they spent less time in the vulnerable position of floating to the ground compared to their Allied counterparts. The downside to this method of descent and subsequent landing was the German paratrooper was unable to carry any weapons while he dropped, except for a pistol, a gravity knife, and some grenades. This is mostly due to the landing, which required the paratrooper to perform a roll, and something like a large rifle could become tangled in the parachute lines or cause injury. More substantial weapons such as rifles and submachine guns and other supplies would be dropped separately in special containers. Early versions of the harness could take over a minute to detach, time in which the Fallschirmjäger was vulnerable. After a disastrous airborne operation on Crete, this harness system was modified and could be removed in under 10 seconds. Also, due to the single riser, they had even less ability to steer than their Allied counterparts. In comparison, the Americans and the British would exit their aircraft, usually a Douglas C-47 Skytrain or a converted Whitley bomber, feet first, and would land on the ground in the same way. There were still differences between the American and British gear, however. The British utilized the X-type parachute, which used a double bag system. The first bag would deploy, releasing the rigging, and then another bag containing the canopy, which was attached to the static line. This was a much more reliable and less jarring system than the single-bag T-7 parachute used by the Americans. Furthermore, the X-type harness was fitted with a quick release that the T-7 lacked, allowing the British paratrooper to detach from the parachute much more quickly than their American allies. Unlike their German counterparts, both the American and the British paratroopers were able to descend with rifles and submachine guns on them, allowing them to fight as soon as they touched the ground. The downside to this configuration was that they had to drop from a higher altitude, making them more vulnerable and giving the enemy more time to prepare, losing them the element of surprise. Also, in spite of their advantageous landing position and quick-release harness, many paratroopers would drown after landing in lakes, marshes, or flooded areas, unable to detach themselves and entangled in their parachutes. For protection, paratroopers use steel helmets, but due to the nature of their mission, these could differ greatly from the types worn by their conventional infantry counterparts. Both the German and British paratroopers were issued specialized helmets. The standard-issue Stahlhelm and Brody helmets, which had distinctive flared edges and prominent rims, were unsuited for airborne operations since they created too much drag. British and German paratroopers were given rimless helmets, which were more aerodynamic and perhaps the most obvious identifying feature of a paratrooper compared to a regular infantryman. The German helmets were so distinctive compared to the standard Stahlhelm that when they were spotted by the Allies, they knew they were fighting an elite group of Fallschirmjägers rather than the regular Wehrmacht. The Americans utilized the M2 helmet or the M1C, which were based off the standard issue M1 helmet. Since it was already a rimless helmet, the most obvious difference was a thicker lining and a Y-shaped 4-point chin strap that prevented the helmet from flying off during a jump. The basic structure of the helmet, however, is very similar and very difficult to differentiate from a standard M1. One piece of equipment that was universal by all paratroopers were special jump boots. Though the exact design did vary from nation to nation, they were all calf length, much longer than a standard infantryman's boot. This was done to support the ankle, preventing injury after the impact of a jump, and the process of blousing or tucking pant legs into the boots to keep them from flapping around during a jump became a symbol of being jump qualified. Even today, American soldiers who are parachute qualified referred to non-qualified soldiers as legs, which is short for straight legs, or those who aren't jump qualified. Since paratroopers are essentially light infantry, they carried the same weapons as their nation's regular infantry, such as the Germans using the Mauser 98K and MP40. The British paratroopers used the Lee-Enfield and Sten gun, though the 1st Airborne Division did have first access to the so-called jungle carbine, the Lee-Enfield rifle No. 5 Mark I, a shortened version of the No. 4 Lee-Enfield. And paratroopers had their own version of the Sten, the Mark V, which had a wooden stock, an Enfield No. 4 sight, and a bayonet mount. American airborne troops used the M1 Garand and M1 carbine, including the M1A1, an M1 carbine with a folding wire stock made specifically for paratroopers, as well as Thompson and M3 submachine guns. Paratroopers would also use other weapons such as anti-tank weapons, mortars, and machine guns. Though they did use similar weapons as regular infantry, there was one notable exception to this rule. The German Fallschirmjägers, whose experiences led to the creation of a specialist weapon, the Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, or Paratroopers Rifle 42. The idea behind the FG-42 was to combine the firepower of a machine gun in a weapon that weighed about the same as a rifle. It was chambered in 7.92 by 57mm and could fire fully automatic with a rate of fire between 750 and 900 rounds per minute, depending on the variant, from a side-mounted 10 or 20-round detachable box magazine. The FG-42 was intended to be a universal firearm, a weapon that gave the firepower of a machine gun in the hands of a rifleman. It was only produced in limited numbers, since the workings were complex, making manufacture difficult. It also had a prodigious muzzle climb, making it inaccurate. Still, the lessons learned during its limited deployment led to the creation of modern assault rifles. After the war ended, nations continued to use paratroopers, though after the advent of reliable helicopter transport, the idea of drifting to the ground, suspended under a silk canopy, became outdated. Still, their exploits are studied to this day by infantry, special forces, or any other unit that's a cut above the rest. No matter which nation they fought for, they represented the elite of the infantry and will remain an iconic symbol of a very specific era in military history.